Poverty in fragile states just doesn't go down. These are the ones that don't converge. They are staying very fragile places, conflict-ridden places, they don't go behind. And we're getting this pattern where there's this brick optimism noise of actually convergence and improving income levels and human development levels in a lot of countries. The ones that don't really change are the fragile places. And all our projections is that actually fragile middle income and lower income countries, it's going to be quite stagnant in poverty, while the green belt, which is actually the non-fragile middle income countries, and I'll say something about it, as the biggest driver of bringing things down. So there's two things here that immediately then jump out. There are very few non-fragile lower income countries left, which already says something about probably a correlation, maybe a causality, that actually conflict is one of the reasons these lower income countries couldn't really follow. There's very little poverty as a result also left in non-fragile lower income countries. And secondly, that even though a lot of people tend to tell you all the poverty is in middle income countries, or 70% at least is it, these are largely countries that graduated into middle income status with a lot of poverty. But if they're more or less functioning places like the Indias of the world or the Bangladeshis of the world, they will build down that stock. They graduated with a stock of poverty, but actually they are on a trajectory of progress. Lots of people misunderstand that. That's this trajectory. Any kind of scenarios, you kind of say, well, this is clearly in the non-fragile middle-income countries, you can build down your poverty stock, and you can do it. So let's not panic about them. I'm optimistic about them. But these are the ones, the fragile ones, where we're all stuck. There's another part of it that I want to emphasize. It's people just usually focus on this kind of green aspect of it. I think there's another part that actually is far more dangerous of the way China the way the Chinese model tends to come into Africa. And that has again close links with, I didn't say too much about it, but it has to do with the idea we do this economic model, everything is contractual. And we never take into account the externalities of any of the contracts we do. And the externalities are not just environmental, and that's what I want to emphasize. The externalities have a lot to do with political and economic governance side. The Chinese even start to recognize that, at least the ones that think, and not necessarily the ones that do all these contracts, which is the following, is that the Chinese institutional setting, of course, was incredibly stable. And the way they were boosting their economy, they were, let's put it like this, is probably the strongest state in the world, in the history of the state and thing. They moved this model into an extremely weak institutional settings. And they suddenly see, as they experienced in South Sudan and Sudan, that actually that piece of paper doesn't mean anything. Or that another faction can be in charge, or that the money that they pay for it, they say, well, that's a contract, surely that goes into I signed it with the Ministry of Finance, so surely this will be on the budget now. Actually, they see it all in an account in Switzerland. That actually they don't realize this externalities. And I think one of the ways of engaging with China is, and that's what I personally have tried to spend quite a lot of time on, is to actually convince them it's in their long-term interest for the economic relationship, that they also focus on the fundamental economic and political governance externalities that it gives. Some of the key stakeholders we talk to, they begin to get this. But it needs somehow translation because it bumps into this problem of the non-interference logic that they want to have in the international global stage. I actually, if I'm really honest, and sometimes I say it seems to be quite public if I'm filmed, to actually say, I wouldn't mind some interference with Chinese characteristics, not just an economic model with Chinese characteristics, to allude to Deng Xiaoping's statement of capitalism with Chinese characteristics, but basically they need to engage. They did it a little bit, and they like to claim they do it already in, say, South Sudan, they're quite active in the diplomacy. It's the beginning, but we need to bring them in, and that's actually crucial for things.
The ones that stood out as being particularly interesting to look at is, of course, eradication of poverty with capacity building. It's looking at the impacts of financial and economic crisis linked to that. It's about climate change, water, food, about peace and security, that was quite clear, and also the trade elements and also the transatlantic agreement, TTIP, came up. So not very conclusive in terms of which ones to put forward, but there should be a good debate about what the value is of integrating ourselves into the SDG kind of approach and being an implementation component of it.
We went to the win-win deals. There again we had a couple of elements. I think that they are all very concrete. They go also around the climate change, and here they are proposed as what would be the deal. Climate change adaptation versus reduction of humanitarian assistance. The same on climate change. Another would be supporting true EU green technology. Another win-win approach. Going forward, green infrastructure in ICP values versus biodiversity carbon sequestration. Fight against the effects of climate change. Technology for small islands and linkage with European island know-how and twinning. So, what else? Yeah, here's some win-win as regards the political stability that fosters economic development, and then the economic development and economic partnership.
We would want the public to see what Europe does. We need public support, and that's something which is which is much more difficult for Europe than for governments to access. And this is so we really need to look at whatever we design as a future for Cotonou. We need to look at how we can ensure or be relatively confident that public support will be coming for it. That should be our mainstreamed in our approach as regards identifying priorities and interests under the successor.
Volley in the current agreement on local authorities and local governments, and then making that part stronger in getting the money where it actually has to be used.
Okay.
So that's a very tricky part because it's linked to governance, but there's a lot of these local governments that are not getting the necessary funding. And to find ways to strengthen that from, just to make that point.
And then there was a whole debate around the topic of good governance, and then the question, can you actually reduce it to just the management of, or effective management of public services, or isn't that actually a wider theme, and what is the role of the value that was discussed? Is democracy as a fundamental value something that should be marketed as heavily or not, or isn't it an inconvenient when maybe a transition could also be fine? And that was not concluded, but definitely good governance emerged as the theme there.
And how 98% of the European population thinks that environment and the protection of environment is hugely important. And then you see the Commission's work program, the overarching work program of the new Commission, and it's hardly there. So it's a bit of a credibility thing, how you make sure that when you ask people and consult people that you then also take it into account. And I think that this is an overall question, but it counts as well for this, I think.
Well, I guess there's always the question about the return on investment, what you get for the money you pay, and whether it's seen as being sufficient or whether it needs improvement. I think a delta is also fine. You don't necessarily always have to ask absolute questions. You can also say, do we need to increase or decrease